A startup nobody's heard of just released an open-source AI model that outperforms ChatGPT on reasoning tasks, and the mainstream press completely ignored it. This isn't hype. This is Minimax's Minimax 01, and it represents something way bigger than one model. It's proof that the age of closed, proprietary AI dominance is ending. Let me explain why this matters, because if you actually care about the future of AI and not just the hype cycle, this is the moment that changes everything. First, the facts. Minimax 01 is a 456 billion parameter model. That's huge, right up there with GPT-4 in scale. But here's the thing. They released it as open source. Completely open. Anyone can download it, run it locally, fine-tune it, modify it. No API key. No subscription. No vendor lock-in. And on multiple reasoning benchmarks. The tests that matter for real problem solving. Not just chatbot fluff. It beats or matches models from OpenAI and Google that cost millions to train and millions more to access. Now, you might be thinking, okay, Ark, so one open model is good. Why does that change everything? Because Minimax 01 isn't alone. It's the loudest signal in a trend that's been building quietly for the last 6 months. We've got Llama 3.1, we've got Mistral's latest models, we've got Qwen from Alibaba, we've got Claude's weights being reverse-engineered by the community. The gap between open and closed is collapsing in real time. Here's what big tech doesn't want you to notice. Open-source AI is cheaper to run, more private, more customizable, and increasingly more capable. A researcher at a university or a small company can now do things with open models that used to require a partnership with OpenAI or a massive cloud budget. That's not incremental. That's a power shift. Let's talk about what this actually means for 3 groups of people. If you're a developer, this is liberation. You're no longer betting your product on OpenAI's pricing whims or their terms of service. You can host Minimax 01 on your own servers, integrate it into your app, and own that relationship. You can fine-tune it on your specific use case. You can make it smaller, faster, cheaper. OpenAI charges you per token. Open source costs you electricity and server time. For most applications, that's 1/10 of the price or less. If you're a company worried about data privacy, and you should be, closed models are a nightmare. Every prompt you send to ChatGPT or Claude might be logged, might be used for training, might leak. With open source, your data never leaves your infrastructure. That's not paranoia, that's due diligence. Enterprises are waking up to this. We're already seeing Fortune 500 companies quietly migrating to open source AI for sensitive work. And if you're just a person who cares about fairness and access, open source AI means the future isn't controlled by 4 companies in San Francisco. It means researchers in India and Indonesia and Brazil can build with the same tools as Stanford. It means the next breakthrough might come from a teenager in a garage instead of a lab with $1 billion budget. But here's where it gets interesting and a little uncomfortable for the incumbents. The open source models aren't just catching up anymore. They're starting to lead on specific tasks. Minimax 01 is better at long context reasoning. Mixtral is better at multilingual work. Qwen is absolutely crushing it in math and coding. The closed source narrative, you need us because we're the only ones with the good stuff, is falling apart. So why isn't this everywhere? Why isn't every tech news site talking about Minimax 01? 3 reasons. First, it's hard to monetize in the traditional sense, so there's no marketing budget behind it. OpenAI spends millions on PR and partnerships. Minimax is a Chinese startup that released a model on GitHub. Second, the narrative around AI has been locked in by big tech's PR machine for 2 years. AI is frontier. AI is dangerous. AI is only accessible through the cloud. AI requires massive resources. That narrative sells expensive APIs and makes regulators nervous. Open source breaks that story. Third, and most cynical, most tech journalists are trained to cover announcements from companies with press teams, not to dig into what's actually happening in open source communities. But the community knows. The engineers know. The startups know. And increasingly, the enterprises know. There's a reason we're seeing a sudden boom in open source AI infrastructure companies. Companies building tools to deploy and fine-tune open models. Llama, Hugging Face, Together AI, Replicate. These aren't startups trying to beat OpenAI. They're startups assuming OpenAI is already losing. Now, let's be real. OpenAI and Anthropic and Google aren't going away. They have advantages. They have compute. They have brand. They have distribution through products people use every day. But their moat, the thing that made them untouchable, was exclusivity. And that moat is gone. Open source AI is now good enough for 80% of real-world use cases, and it's improving faster than the closed models. What comes next? I think we see a split. You'll have the frontier models, the GPT-5s and the Claude 4s, which stay closed and expensive and focused on the hardest problems. And you'll have the commodity models, the open source stuff, which become the default for everything else. It's like the cloud. AWS is still the frontier, but everyone also uses open source infrastructure. Both can exist, but the economics flip. Proprietary becomes the exception, open source becomes the baseline. The second shift is speed. Open source development moves faster than corporate development. You've got thousands of researchers worldwide fine-tuning and optimizing these models. You've got competition happening in real time. The next breakthrough in AI might not come from a lab with 1,000 H100 GPUs. It might come from someone who figured out how to get 90% of the performance with 10% of the compute. That's the kind of innovation open source rewards. And here's the thing that actually scares big tech. Once the models are good enough and open, the real value moves upstream and downstream. It's not in the model anymore. It's in the data, the fine-tuning, the integration, the specific applications. That's a much more fragmented market, much harder to monopolize, much better for everyone else. So what should you actually do with this information? If you're building something AI-powered, stop assuming you need to use OpenAI's API. Seriously, run some benchmarks on open models. You might be shocked at what you can do for a fraction of the cost. If you're worried about data privacy, this is your escape route. If you're interested in actually learning how these things work instead of just using them as a black box, open source is where that happens. And if you're just trying to understand where AI is actually going, past the hype and the press releases, pay attention to what's happening in open source. That's where the real game is. Minimax 01 is just the loudest signal. The trend is already baked in. If you want to stay ahead of what's actually changing in AI, instead of just following the headlines, subscribe. I break down these shifts every few days, and most of them never hit the mainstream until they've already won. Thanks for watching.